In The Phantom Menace, the Republic doesn't exist on Tatooine. Shmi Skywalker says as much, we see active slavery, and the planet is under the control of Jabba the Hutt. In Episode 4, Luke's friends have all gone off to join the Imperial Academy, and Luke's about to join them, something that Anakin and Kidster could never have dreamed of. We also see the Empire have a significant presence during the search for R2-D2 and C-3PO at least, despite the fact that we also see the world is still the home base of Jabba the Hutt in Episode 6. So what changed over the 30 years between Episode 1 and Episode 4? How did the world go from being entirely outside of the Republic to being within the Imperial sphere of influence, and what does that mean for the relationship with the Hutts on the planet? That's basically the question asked by patron Hawkeye Pierce in my Discord, and today we're going to talk about why it's all Rotta the Hutt's fault. Okay, so maybe saying it's all Rotta's fault is a bit of an exaggeration, but it's not entirely wrong. And more importantly, this is one example of how the Clone Wars was able to expand the Republic and then the Empire's reach, even if the belligerents were technically the Republic on one side and the planets who seceded from the Republic on the other. The Clone Wars were, in practice, often an experiment in colonialism and imperialism, consolidating more of the galaxy under one power than really at any other point in galactic history, despite the war theoretically being about seceding from the Republic. I spoke about that a little bit in a recent video about the kind of local nature of the Clone Wars, especially with respect to Geonosis, but today we're going into more detail on how that impacted planets under the Empire. So let's start by talking about Hutt space more generally. If you look at maps of the galaxy during the Clone Wars or before the Clone Wars, the Hutts were effectively at a territorial historical peak, controlling, let's say, about a third of the known galaxy. But then if you get to the Imperial period, the Hutts are condensed down to their historical core, and pretty much all maps, not just my animated ones, will show planets like Tatooine as within the Empire and outside of Hutt space, even though, again as we see in Episode 6, Jabba is still living in a palace on Tatooine. This isn't the contradiction it may seem like at first. Especially when it comes to the Hutts, control is never really about being recognized as the official government somewhere. And in general, astrographic maps are a lot more porous than they seem. The Outer Rim in particular was often a mess of planets, some of which were fully part of the Republic, some of which were fully independent, and some of which were theoretically under the Republic's rule, or the rule of Republic-aligned megacorporations, but where the day-to-day life was more dominated by either the Hutts, other criminal syndicates, or other groups. There's a whole world of different possible arrangements for planetary governance, and it's just that as the Empire came in, more and more of that kind of shifted towards at least the idea of centralized control. So Tatooine, before the Clone Wars, was pretty openly and pretty directly ruled by the Hutts. But as the Empire spread across the galaxy, it didn't behoove the Hutts to try to fight the Empire for open control of every bit of territory. That was functionally meaningless to them. The Empire cared about the appearance of control and the ability to extract resources as much as actually controlling the territory. They didn't really mind the kind of crime that the Hutt presence could lead to as long as their operations weren't interfered with. And the Hutts didn't care about the kind of military presence the Empire could lead to as long as their criminal operations weren't interfered with. So there were significant areas where the Empire had theoretically expanded its borders far beyond the Republic, but where the implementation of Imperial policy was likely done in, let's say, cooperation with the Hutts or other organizations. So where does Rotta, aka Stinky, come into this? The core plot of the 2008 animated Clone Wars movie involves the Republic recovering Jabba's son Rotta in order to gain access to Hutt hyperspace lanes, which presumably included not just the core we'd recognize as Imperial-era Hutt space, but also, and probably especially, areas outside of Hutt space, or the core Hutt space, like the Arkanis sector where Tatooine was found. Throughout the Clone Wars, this would have meant a buildup of not just Republic forces, but also all the logistical support that goes along with waging a war. So you'd have potentially bases created, supplies and convoys moving through all the time, and just generally an expanded, kind of centralized presence. And this again is just one case study in a type of thing which was happening throughout the galaxy. The Imperial fortification and exploration of the deep core, for example, was done by Grand Army of the Republic forces setting up bases which would almost never see conflict during the Clone Wars themselves, but which decades later would serve as the primary seat of Imperial power when the Empire fractured into warlords. And the knowledge of these hyperspace routes through the deep core was able to be furnished by the Imperials to the New Republic for the pivotal Battle of Ebac 9 during the Yuzon Vong Wars. So again, the presence of the Empire on Tatooine wasn't entirely Rotta's fault, but it wasn't not Rotta's fault. His kidnapping and the negotiation of hyperlane access was a major step in allowing the Republic to like this video, subscribe for more, and less importantly, to access those areas. The wartime command of forces in these areas then extended what became Imperial political influence in a similar way. You can think of American Pacific political influence after World War II in a somewhat similar way. So the Empire gained these areas, and it wasn't really in the game of giving control back once it had it. When the Empire established its own oversectors, sectors, moffs, and governors, areas formerly under the massive umbrella of Hutt space were included in the new carved-out sectors. For example, there's the Baxel sector governed by Moff Sarn Shield, right next to the core Hutt territory. Most relevant for our purposes, of course, there was Tatooine's home sector, Arkanis. Arkanis was legally, at least according to the Empire, governed by Moff Alexander Jolston IV, but as we know, the Hutts, particularly Jabba, maintained a significant presence operating out of the sector. Jolston was known to indulge in some of the less savory things Moffs far away from Coruscant could get away with, like enslaving Twi'lek dancers. But beyond that, we don't have a ton of information on his specific actions. We do have a lot more information about Moff Sarn Shield in the Baxel sector, and his experience gives us a bit more information on what governing these kinds of territories possibly typically looked like. The Hutts, while not interested in active military campaigns, though they did hold significant military power in reserve, did find the idea of direct Imperial control unappealing. Usually, this meant a series of arrangements between the local Imperial leaders and the Hutts, allowing the Hutts to continue on their way in exchange for goods and services. In other words, bribery and corruption was the understanding both sides had of how they could maintain the appearance of military and political control for the Empire without turning into an active armed conflict. Moff Shield saw things a little bit differently, deciding that the Hutt should be brought entirely to heel. He even ordered Admiral Greelanx to base Delta Zero Nar Shaddaa, essentially eliminating all life on the planet. The Hutt Council had tried to bribe Shield away from his destructive course of action, but Shield wouldn't be deterred. Because again, neither side wanted their carefully constructed fiction of Imperial control to be destroyed, Shield's superiors had instructed Greelanx to make sure the invasion of Nar Shaddaa failed, which it ultimately did. This venture had been about bringing Imperial control even deeper within Hutt space than typical, so the Hutts would have been even more opposed to Imperial presence, but you can kind of make a gradient of how okay they were with Imperial interference based on the distance from Nal Hutta itself, and this kind of worked both ways. The closer you were to Nal Hutta, the more the Empire would have to accept control by the Hutts over day-to-day life. The farther you were from Nal Hutta, the more likely the Hutts were to just be okay with being able to operate in the background, while the Empire had the kind of appearance of control. So somewhere like Tatooine, the Hutts would still have been upset with the Empire interrupting their own operations, but what did the Empire really care if a garrison was deployed near Mos Eisley, or there were checkpoints set up going in and out of the city to find these droids? To get back to Hawkeye's original question, we do actually know where this specialized equipment came from without it actually having to be a dedicated permanent garrison, thanks to an article called Tinker Tailor Soldier Prodigy. There'd been a training program planned for a unit called the Desert Sands brought in on the ISD Inquisitor, so it wasn't necessarily a standing garrison, but that probably would have been able to be arranged by the Empire provided they didn't mess with the Hutts too much. And the way the Empire probably saw it over time, you would probably expect that they would chip away at Hutt authority in various areas, integrating these kinds of territories more and more under true Imperial control. Imperialism and colonialism often leads to some messy borders and less than clear questions of control, and this is an instance where we're looking at two different kinds of Imperial powers, the Hutts and the Empire, vying for two different types of control over the same territory, but where both powers know it's not really in their interest to engage in open conflict. That's expensive, after all. Other areas were probably far easier to integrate into the Empire, like what we talked about with the Deep Core, simply because there was no other major competition to go through. There may have been individual planets governed by individual governors, but there wasn't this kind of power block the Empire had to compete against in the same way they did with the Hutts in parts of the Outer Rim. Thanks again to Hawkeye for the question. Feel free to leave other questions you'd like to see answered in the comments or on the Discord question thread. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.